fiscal policy is on an unsustainable path. The level of our debt relative to the economy is not unsustainable. The path is unsustainable.
The United States has been running up a large tab for years now, going from a debt of $5.7 trillion in 2000 to over $35 trillion in 2024. And so far, it doesn't show any signs of slowing down, with the Congressional Budget Office projecting that, at the rate it's going, the U.S. will owe over $50 trillion by 2035, or about 118% of its annual GDP.
The debt ceiling was...
The Trump administration comes to office aware of the challenge posed by the federal debt and is taking steps it says will help address the problem.
The federal government has a significant spending problem.
Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio has written a new book, available at no charge online, addressing the U.S. debt problem. It's called How Countries Go Broke. And he starts with how much the U.S. is going to have to borrow and who will lend it the money it needs.
The difference is they can print money. What you have is a situation where there's a supply and a demand for debt. As we have a new supply, that will equal in the United States now, by the way, this is a problem elsewhere too, but it's about 7.5% of GDP. So the supply of debt is going to be large. That's new debt. If I calculate also who are the buyers of that debt, and that there's not going to be enough demand for that debt. It doesn't look like there'll be enough demand. And the way that it works, so there's two things to keep in mind. There's supply and demand, and then what do central banks do, or what do the governments do when they don't have enough demand? Central banks come in and make up that demand. They essentially print money, and then they buy that. And then that has a consequence. And so just like in 2020, 21, we went through, they needed to give money away, and the government needed to borrow, and the central bank produced the money and bought that. That devalues money, raises inflation, and so on.
Thus far, the United States has been able to support ever-growing debt and deficits because of that ability to print money. But Dalio warns that, throughout history, countries have run up against the demand of creditors sooner or later to get paid.
It is when the owners of that debt, we have, over $36 trillion essentially of government debt, when they start to also fear that it may be monetized, like the Japanese. Japanese is a very good example. Japanese, if you have terrible investment to own bonds, they didn't go down in value, but you got an interest rate that was 3% below another interest rate, U.S. interest rate by example, and the currency depreciated by 3.5%. They were losing 6.5% a year for many, many years. Of course, there's an inflation component that enters into the depreciation. One of the things I also want to emphasize is people pay too much attention to depreciation against another exchange rate. Normally at such times, many countries have this issue, and they don't want their currency to depreciate. So what you see is the depreciation of all currencies in relationship to things like gold or other assets, and that's where you have to pay attention to it.
So if there is a debt wall out there somewhere that we will run into, how close are we to it? And how can we tell? As with our personal finances, Dalio says it's when we end up borrowing not to invest in our future, but to pay the interest on what we've already borrowed.
Debt isn't a problem if the debt is used to produce an income that is large enough or larger than enough to service the debt. It's like a company, more like your finances. But what happens is it accumulates, tends to accumulate. Think of it like a disease that has a progression, and it goes through these various stages. And so you can kind of see where the stages are. We're relatively late in the cycle because we're also having central banks lose money. That's a marker. When their balance sheet deteriorates, when they have a negative net worth. For example, in the UK, can the central bank have a negative net worth? According to their laws, the central government has got to recapitalize the bank. That becomes a budget item. So there are certain red flags. There are a bunch in this study that I've put out so that you could see them. debt service payments, borrowing to borrow. So we are in the later stages of this. This is something that will be, I think, the most important issue that we'll be talking about. We're not talking about it now, but we will be talking about it over the next few months because the budget is the issue.
Dalio sees signs in the market that now point toward the end of the cycle.
What happens is that you see interest rates rise, led by the long end, when there's an easing of monetary policy and the currency depreciating. Well, you think, wait, isn't the Fed lowering interest rates? Isn't the Bank of England lowering interest rates? Why are long-term interest rates going up? Okay, they're not intervening. Well, there must be something with the supply-demand of those bonds because it's not their transactions that are driving those interest rates up. And the currency is falling at the same time. Okay, that is reflecting leaving, in other words, selling the bonds and leaving that instrument. So when you have that dynamic, it's a red flag. So we're having elements of that dynamic. So not only is the supply-demand operating that way, but the market action is operating that way.
If Dalio is right, if the United States is approaching the end of what he calls the long debt cycle, what should it do to make sure it doesn't hit that wall?
There are three factors that drive the budget deficit. Spending, cut spending, it'll be reduced. Taxes, raise taxes, not tax rates, but taxes. Sometimes you can cut tax rates and get that more tax revenue. So I just want to say taxes, tax revenue. But interest, if the government was operating as a unit with the central bank and there was a coordination, if there was a fiscal tightening coordinated with monetary easing, both of those things reduce the problem. And so an action of getting it at 3% of GDP, if I scream out a number, the 3% solution, I think that the policymakers have to start from the top and say, 3% of GDP, we can do this, we will do this in one way or another. They can't let their pet programs, I think they don't have that mantra. They don't have what is the amount, and then they have to agree, at least if we can't agree, what do we do? Do it proportionately. Whatever you do, you must do this. Because if you don't, you are risking what I would call, this heart attack due to that constriction of debt service payments and or a piece of that plaque breaking off sort of the sale of those bonds. You're risking that needlessly. And so many things are so beautiful, you don't need to do that.
In the end, Dalio's How Countries Go Broke isn't simply a jeremiad. It does warn of some pretty dire consequences if we don't act, and don't act soon. But he also sees a path forward toward what he calls a beautiful deleveraging.
A beautiful deleveraging, one way or another, is there's ways of reducing your debt and debt burdens, some of which are deflationary and some of which are inflationary. And if you balance those, you will reduce it in a balanced way. That's what I mean by beautiful deleveraging. So, for example, fiscal spending cuts or tightening, raising taxes, will reduce the debt burden, but it's a deflationary influence. There's interest rates, and reducing interest rates is a stimulative way because it reduces debt service payments directly for the government, so they have a lower debt bill, and it also is stimulative to the economy at the same time, which can raise tax revenues and also raise asset prices. If we think beyond what our usual constraints are about dealing with the budget, in other words, don't just think about spending and taxes as vehicles, but also think about interest rates and the interest rate component. That could be a balance dealing with that reduction that can accomplish the goal without being depressing and gets it on a better fiscal track.